hear me? No. Woo! Okay. Can you hear me now? I used to have this professor that would always say, can you hear me in the back? We were in this like giant seating. Anyway, you don't care about that. So let's talk about de-escalating student behavior. So something to round out the day with, right? I'm glad that you are here, the ones of you that stuck around, and I promise I will try to be brief and also give you some opportunities to talk with one another. So I know you're probably pretty tired by this point in the day. Lots of listening. So I've already told you, I think, I'm Kathleen Strickland-Cohen, and I'm a professor at the University of Utah in the Special Education Department. So I wanted to know, though, and I may have missed this, you may have already kind of done this earlier and I wasn't at that talk, but I kind of wanted to get a sense of who you all are. And I know we're not going to go around the room and do introductions, that would take the rest of the time, but just by a show of hands, how many of you are teachers? Nice. How about administrators? Administrators, okay, support staff, a few folks, okay, PBIS coaches or outside consultants, so those that work with schools from the outside, good. University faculty, I see one, and anybody else that has a burning desire to tell me what they do other than what's on this list? Okay, but thank you, it's kind of nice to have a sense of who's in the audience, so I appreciate that. I do also want to acknowledge the folks that helped in writing this brief that I'm going to be describing today. So I'm throwing in a few things that aren't part of the brief, but most of what I'm going to be discussing today is from this brief that we wrote on strategies for de-escalating student behavior in the classroom that you can find on pbis.org. So freely available resource. I think it's a pretty good one. I feel like I'm doing like this weird S thing from up here. Are my S's like bugging you all? Okay, it must be just from my point of view. Thank you. So disclaimer, really quickly, I feel like I'm contractually obligated to say this as well, that we are not going to be discussing anything today that is meant to take the place of your district policies and regulations related to crisis management. So we're going to be talking about things hopefully that will supplement your policies and practices with a focus on preventing escalation and de-escalating student behavior before it gets to the point of crisis. We will be discussing strategies for addressing crisis and what to do after, but I want you to make sure that we are mostly focused on how do we prevent this, right? How do we get things going in the right direction after they're already sort of headed off the cliff? So today's objectives, we're going to talk about how the PBIS framework can help to support student self-regulation, class-wide strategies needed to support de-escalation. That's right, I said class-wide strategies. So what are some of the things that we can do ahead of time for all of our students? In the moment strategies that we can use when a student becomes dysregulated. An example of crisis support routine to supplement what you're already doing with your safety protocols. So even if, for example, you've had to call for help, right? You've had to say, okay, we really have gone to crisis mode here and we have to call for help. There's still things we can do in the meantime, even while we're waiting for someone else to come. And then also strategies to increase the odds that you yourself will stay calm during these moments. So, which is a big part of this. And I really like this meme that I've seen quite a few times. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotion, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. Yeah, and I think that we can also add when big people, right? So regardless of who is dysregulated or who is having a really hard time, it is our job to share our calm. And it's really hard to do that when we ourselves are in an upset kind of dysregulated state. So we're going to talk some about that as well. Sorry, I saw some phones, so if you want to do that one. But, okay, so the current context, I feel like I don't need to tell any of you this, but those of you that are working in schools may have noticed a slight uptick in some challenges with our students in the last couple of years. I can't imagine why. So research shows us that following the pandemic-related lockdowns, there has been an increase in child and youth depression and anxiety, and also, unfortunately, suicidal ideation and self-harm. So this study that came out in 2021 was looking at emergency room visits and deaths related to suicidal ideation in children and youth, and it has definitely significantly increased since the pandemic. We've also noticed, so that was more internalizing challenges that we think about, but also in a recent study, 7 in 10 teachers nationwide reported externalizing student behavior as the biggest barrier to recovery following the pandemic and a significant source of educator stress. So, all of the folks that I've worked with in schools kind of echo this information. So I don't think that it's just us as researchers telling you this. I think this is something that we're seeing very much in typical practice as well. So I don't have to walk you through the triangle at this point, but I, again, just wanted to highlight the fact that even our students that are receiving support at advanced tiers are still going to be receiving everything that we're hopefully providing at Tier 1. And when I was thinking about the previous data the other day, what came to mind was when we're facing a school-wide or even district-wide issue, we need school-wide solutions. And what I mean by that is sometimes, depending on what our student population looks like, and I'm not just talking demographically, I mean what we're seeing in terms of their behavior, needs to shift how we're thinking about Tier 1. It needs to shift how we're thinking about the supports that we're providing for all students across our school and across our district. So probably now more than ever, we want to think about a holistic approach to addressing our students, so not just building academic competence, but we know that we also want to actively support student relationships, self-regulation, also physical and emotional well-being. And within schools implementing PBIS, we're trying to do this by creating environments that are not only positive, but are also predictable and consistent for our students, that are safe, and that are equitable for all of our students. So let's talk about incorporating de-escalation practices within our school-wide preventative frameworks. And I'm going to sort of walk you through what our team, the folks and I that wrote the brief, how we've conceptualized the de-escalation sort of phases. It's very similar to ones that you've seen before, but slight tweaks that we've made. Before we get there, let's talk about a few terms. So what we mean by de-escalation. So de-escalation isn't just about, we're already at crisis mode and we're trying to come back down. It's also the process of preventing challenging situations essentially from becoming worse. And by doing this through using communication and other non-physical techniques to stabilize, slow, or reduce the intensity of the harmful behavior or sort of the direction of where things are going. So we're trying to turn things around, but I really like the first part of this definition. So the process of preventing a challenging situation from becoming worse. Right, so the reason I like that is because, again, when we're thinking about this from a multi-tiered perspective, to me that means any situation that is challenging. We're trying to prevent that from becoming worse. So again, like that early intervention piece that I talked about earlier, like catch it low when we can and turn things around. Regulation is a state of being in which a person feels safe, present, and engaged. Dysregulation, or you may have heard this as fight, flight, or freeze kind of responding. It's characterized by either hyperarousal, so things like emotional reactivity, aggression, even elopement or running out of the classroom, or hypoarousal, which things like shutting down, disconnecting from others, and maybe even disassociating from the situation. Again, these aren't things that someone is doing on purpose, right? We're having a physiological response. So sometimes, for example, if you are trying to interact with a student who's completely shut down and is not responding to you, they literally may not even be hearing what you're saying to them in that moment, or at least not processing what you're saying. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. See, your computer needs to regulate. So, so self-regulation is our ability to manage emotions and behavior in accordance with the demand of the situation. So this includes being able to resist becoming highly emotional in reaction to upsetting stimuli, to calm yourself down, or ask for what you need. So some of that stuff that we were talking about earlier, really teaching students how to ask for what they need when they get upset as opposed to sort of having a meltdown. Adjust to changes in expectations and frustration without having outbursts. So those were some of the things that we would consider to be self-regulatory behaviors. And the goal of a number of the de-escalation strategies that we're going to talk about is, in part, to teach these types of self-regulation skills. So what does regulation look like in the classroom? So students who are regulated, they are able to engage with academic materials, focus on tasks, interact with us as adults and peers in ways that fit the context, and respond to instruction. I want to highlight here that that does not mean that a student that is regulated is never going to engage in problem behavior. So students who are regulated may still engage in interfering behavior. I like that term, interfering. I'm having a hard time even remembering to always use that term, but I kind of want that to catch on because it's this idea of it's a behavior that's interfering with student learning as opposed to sort of problem behavior that we sometimes want to sort of label or place a label on the child with. So I like the term interfering. But they're typically able to respond to some of our Tier 1 strategies or some of what we think of as just being basic classroom management strategies. So at the lowest level, things like literally like Sarah Pinkelman mentioned earlier, walking over just proximity. Those kind of low-level strategies may be able to be effective when students are regulated, even if they're engaging in challenging behavior at that time. Dysregulated student behavior, on the other hand, in the classroom, I want to read this because I want you to focus on what I'm saying. So students who are dysregulated are often unable to follow directions, learn or process new information, or reflect on their own behavior in the moment. So I actually want you to think about that because I want you to do a turn and talk really quick and take a couple of minutes to discuss why do you think it is so important to understand and consider this type of definition of dysregulation when we're responding to escalated student behavior in the classroom. So take about 2 minutes and talk amongst yourselves, consider sharing out. Okay, it has been exactly 2 minutes. So if you can hear my voice, please raise your hand. Thank you. A little regulation strategy there. So what do you think? Does somebody want to share out? So why is it so important that we consider this understanding or this type of definition of dysregulation when we're addressing escalated student behavior?
I think we can all think of times in our life where we may have not been as well regulated and maybe how those times made us feel. So if you think about it from that lens, about how a child who doesn't always have the communication or verbalization skills to be able to, they certainly have to learn what it means to be dysregulated, and then they also need to know before they get that point. So it's going to be a series of skills that need to be taught in a process to be able to help them to be able to become better regulated.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much. So yes, we have to teach these skills. I mean, many of us, I had an example that I won't go into with you all just last week where I felt completely dysregulated. I'm an adult, fully functioning adult, and I wasn't able to control my emotions in that moment. So, you know, our kiddos are the same way, right? Except maybe they even lack some of the coping skills that we have already as adults. So this is important. You know, one of the things that we're going to talk about too as we move through different phases of escalation is this idea that throwing a lot of words at a kiddo that is dysregulated is like spitting in the wind, don't they say? You know, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The student's not necessarily hearing you, and oftentimes it can actually exacerbate the situation or make things worse. So we really want to kind of gauge where our students are when they're engaging in these types of interfering behaviors and look for certain signs. And part of that is also getting to know our students well enough that we even can recognize some of what we think of as precursor behaviors. So I know that when my student has a certain look on their face that they're getting upset, or I know when they pull their hoodie up and put their head down, you know, it might be that overt, or for some of the students that I've worked with in the past, they're very sort of hard to see, really subtle changes, but we can get to know our students well enough to look for those changes over time. So let's talk about the phases of de-escalation. So I know this is tiny writing, so I'm going to read this to you, and then we don't have to look at all of these pieces right now, but I just want you to see that the phases that we're going to be talking through are prevention, escalation, crisis, and then recovery and restoration. So those are the big phases that we're going to be talking about. So within prevention, we're looking for things like active supervision in the classroom, the use of evidence-based classroom management practices and strategies, and of course, high-quality instruction. One of the things that I think that I will speak for myself, like we as behavior analysts or folks that are so focused sometimes on interfering behavior don't think about or talk about rather enough, is the idea that if we have really strong instructional practices going on in our classrooms, that's half the battle right there. Because if students are highly engaged in the content and it's content that they can access and use, ta-da, we see a lot less challenging behavior. So that's also a really important piece. Also as important as actively building positive relationships with students. This is something that we need to be working on daily. Establishing, teaching, and acknowledging class-wide expectations, that should be something that's very familiar to you, but we're going to talk about this within the context of de-escalation. And then having a continuum of responses for interfering behavior. So one of my favorite mentors that I worked with at Texas Christian University, she always used to say, you don't go after a gnat with an elephant gun. And I wish I could say it exactly like her. She had this strong Southern accent, and it was beautiful when she said it. But I like that idea, right? We're going to sort of match our response in some ways to, and some of that will come with us being able to regulate our own behavior. So if I get really ticked off, the way that I'm going to respond is going to be different than if I can sort of rein my own emotions in. So building relationships, I don't think I have to describe to you why that's so important. I already mentioned a couple of reasons, but a big piece when we're talking about de-escalation is to just remember that a lot of the strategies that we're going to be discussing using are really unlikely to be effective if that student doesn't like you and or doesn't feel welcome in your classroom and or doesn't feel part of your classroom. So if I'm trying to, for example, you're dysregulated, I'm trying to walk you through a strategy for calming down, how's that going to go if we don't have a relationship? Not well, most likely. So we really want to focus on building relationships. Some evidence-based strategies for doing this, of course, include things like greeting students when they come into the door, creating space for activities that foster authentic connection in the classroom, identifying individual student strengths and interests, going back to what we were talking about this morning, knowing what a student's reinforcers are. That's huge. It's not just that we use those to to teach new behavior or new skills, it's also that a student feels seen and heard. You know, for you to be able to say, hey, I heard this particular song on the radio the other night, and I know you like that band. You know, that's a big thing for a student. I do that for my university students. I try to get to know them on the level that I can bring them into my examples in class. Communicating with families and building relationships and trust there, that can't really be overstressed as well. And then ending the day or class with predictable routines and advance notice. So of course we want predictable routines throughout the day, but for some of our students, school is the most sort of, it's mostly the safest place in their life, is what I'm trying to say. So having that sort of predictability and knowing what's coming next can be really helpful for some of our students that are leaving our context and going to hard places. So ending the day with a predictable routine, and also, again, that advance notice of what's coming tomorrow. So I know what to look forward to. I know what to anticipate. That can be really helpful for some of our students. I'm not going to read these to you, but our friends at Midwest PBIS, if you go to their website, and I'm sure probably even Michigan MTSS has lots of sort of resources and strategies. The ones that I found when I was talking to my colleagues specifically focus on student surveys, you know, getting to know your students, having a sense and giving them the opportunity to let you know what they like, you know, name one person that you look up to and why. How might someone else describe you in 3 words? You know, there's all kinds of questions that we can ask our students in addition to what we do in class. And then also having similar types of surveys where we ask families similar questions. So asking families, what do you see as your students' strengths? You know, not every family is going to have the privilege or the opportunity to come to something like family night or meet the teacher night because of their work or other barriers that they face. So asking families in this way. And because I think relationship building with students and families is so important, I want to sort of capitalize on the expertise in this room as well. And I'd like for you to talk with one another about what are techniques or strategies that you use to identify students' strengths and preferences and connect regularly with and communicate with families. Mostly, again, when I have this many educators in one room, I like to sort of brainstorm a bit. So if there are strategies that you currently use, talk about it a moment and then be willing, if you would, to share. So if you think you have a great strategy that you would like to share out, please feel free to step up to the mics. Take a couple minutes to do that. Okay, let's take about 10 seconds to all come back. And again, if any of you have things you'd like to share, feel free to step up to the mics. Anything? Hopefully. I also overheard a couple of conversations that made me think that I should have also said, I'm sure many of you are parents as well. So if you've been on the receiving end of some kind of information or technique that you found helpful. Is it because it's after lunch and nobody wants to stand up?
I can share one from online.
Yeah.
Someone was sharing that every Friday their students do a small group tutorials whilst they have individual meetings with each student as a check-in, discussing their strengths, positive things that they accomplished that week.
Nice. Very nice. Yeah, there's so many ways that we can efficiently and effectively, right? Again, we're not talking, none of the strategies that we're going to be discussing mean that we're going to take 45 minutes out of our instructional day to do this. I mean, but a little at a time, consistently over time, allows us to do a much better job of getting to know our students and their families. Like I said, for my university students, I do the same kind of thing. I provide surveys the first night of class because I want to know things like, what have you done before? Most of my students are graduate students, so what have you done before? Why are you coming back? What are your hopes with doing this? And then also, give me some personal information. Do you have 3 kiddos at home while you're also going to school? I need to know these things when I'm working with students, and we all need to think about those kinds of connections. Okay, so we've talked about, at length, I'm sure anytime you go listen to people talk about PBIS, we're talking about expectations in the classroom, right? We're going to teach the behaviors that we want to see more of and that we expect. But part of this is also about anticipating challenges and being really thoughtful in specifically our class-wide programming. So there's school-wide expectations, and we want to link our class-wide expectations back to that. But depending on our population of students, we want to be really thoughtful about what are the challenges that we're anticipating with this group, and how can I prevent those challenges by teaching certain skills ahead of time. So when we're thinking about dysregulation in particular, we're thinking about teaching and regularly practicing regulation strategies with our students. So, first we want to start this by teaching these when students are all calm and it's just kind of like, hey, we're going to do this for a fun, activity. Over time, though, we want to work toward actually practicing these strategies in advance of situations in which a lot of students have challenges. So, right before a test is taken, maybe before certain transitions that are hard for some of our students or all of our students, pep rallies for some of our students, or sort of large group kind of what's the word I'm looking for? That thing you do in the auditorium. Assemblies. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, exactly. So, depending on the age group, but some of us, I don't know, like myself, large groups of people can be challenging. So, providing these kinds of self-regulatory strategies that students can use ahead of time can be really helpful. We can even build these into our classroom and class-wide and also school-wide matrices. So you're very familiar, right? Everybody raise your hand if you're familiar with a matrix. Anybody that's not probably hasn't been doing this very long. But so thinking about specifically, if you'll look at this matrix, for example, we've got, expected behavior, respectful, organized and achieving, responsible, and we've got that across different routines, but it also says here when you feel upset. So what does it look like to be respectful when you feel upset? So asking for a break if you need a moment, expressing your feelings appropriately. And of course, that's something that we would teach very explicitly using examples and non-examples. If you need help being organized, talk to someone. Talk to someone if it will make you feel better or if it's helpful in some way. Express to them that you're having a hard time with being organized. So these are just a few examples, but I think you can see how we can build these things in very intentionally when we're thinking about building our expectations for our classroom. Also here, I like this one. It says, when in being responsible, if I feel upset, I can stop and take a few deep breaths and recognize what I'm feeling. So this is just one example of a strategy or type of strategy that you may use, but the important piece here is thinking about how are we teaching our students to recognize their feelings and to communicate those feelings. So this is, like I said, just one example. There are thousands of these examples online that are all sort of age appropriate depending on what you're looking for. This one's fairly complicated, but I like it because it's not only how do you feel, but what can you do? What can you do when you feel that way? Everything from I'm happy and calm, which means maybe I could look for someone else to help or support. Notice and enjoy your positive moods, so sort of building in some of that mindfulness. All the way to when I'm anxious, worried, or unsettled, maybe I need to talk to a family member or a friend, or in this case, my classroom teacher. Pay attention to each of your senses for a few seconds. So again, that's one of those mindfulness behaviors. And focus on what you can control. Other examples would be teaching some of those mindfulness strategies with our students. So connecting to breath, progressive muscle relaxation. These are also things, of course, that we as staff can do. Providing a break space in the classroom and teaching students how and when to ask for a break and indicate how to use that break space. So everyone's going to learn how to do this. I put here, though, this is a very important piece. Again, we never do just one strategy, right? So another really important piece of this is that, yes, we are going to provide that break space, but we're also pairing this, again, with high quality instruction. We're pairing this with lots of opportunities to respond and be engaged and lots of acknowledgement and reinforcement for on-task behavior. Because we don't want that break space to become more reinforcing than being part of the classroom and enjoying academic tasks and peer-related tasks, right? So we want to make sure that we have an enriched environment that students don't want to leave unless they truly need to take a break. And sometimes we all need to take a break, let's face it. So some more strategies: schedule and think aloud why we need things like movement and advance notice of transitions. Organization time. So with this movement, I like this idea of with young children, talking through in your head as a teacher, like, I've been sitting for a while. I think I need to move. Or, maybe you have one student that's particularly squirrely. Can they lead stretching for the whole class? So maybe that's something that could feed two birds with one seed, right? Advanced notice of transitions. This is something that many of our students will benefit from. So yes, there are some students that actually have that built into their plans, but I don't know too many students that don't benefit from knowing what's coming up next and having a chance to sort of regulate in that state. So again, as a teacher, particularly of young children, we think about sort of how do we talk this out loud for our students. So we're going to switch from art to reading in 3 minutes. How can I get ready for that? And talking through how you're going to do that. And I think, too, for our older students in particular, and it also helps with that relationship building piece, but just being really open about your own need for regulation at times. So I've definitely come in and said, wow, I'm so sorry. I overslept this morning, and you know how that throws your whole day off, and so this is what I'm doing to kind of get my stuff in order. So I'm talking out loud and thinking out loud so that my students can see, here's a strategy that I might use, and also that this is perfectly normal. It's typical to have times when you feel this way. So we're making it we're normalizing that or making it okay. And then I just love this strategy. I can't take credit for this. I saw this one online. But organization time. Like for some of our students in particular, having daily and weekly scheduled time to organize themselves. So for little kids, it might be organizing their desk. For older students, think about with our older students how many different things they have to navigate throughout their day and throughout their week in terms of deadlines and going to see all these different teachers and having different assignments. And some of our students really start to falter when that becomes an issue. So having times where they can actually schedule or build in times, that are scheduled to work on that kind of organization can be helpful for everyone. It also helps us to do this regularly because it teaches students that organization is not something we do one time. I wish my husband understood that, but he doesn't. So maybe we'll start working on this as well at home. Also part of prevention is this co-regulation piece. So when I say co-regulation, this comes back to we as adults also need to be regulated. So we want to seek learning opportunities focused on stress reduction techniques for staff And when I say this, I'm not talking about bubble baths and, yoga, which those things are great. Please do those things for yourself. But I'm talking more about stress reduction in the moment. Like when this kiddo has just really pushed my buttons, and kids learn what our buttons are and they push them on the regular. So learning how we respond to that and how we can remain calm when that happens is a big piece of this. So seeking out training on how to do that can be helpful. Modeling, again, using those think aloud strategies for self-regulation. We've already talked a little bit about that, like how do we show students that we also are regulating our own emotions from time to time, and they can sort of hear our thoughts by us thinking aloud. Using self-prompting strategies like visual reminders and timers to prompt us to use those self-regulation strategies, because sometimes we need those throughout the day, not just when we get upset. So just like with our students, when we're teaching those things when the students are calm, we also have to practice things when we're calm. I'm personally currently taking a mindfulness course and finding it really helpful. So these are important things. And then becoming aware of our triggers and having strategies for what to do. So some of this is about practicing, like being aware of kiddo X, I mean, I worked in schools for a long time with kids, and I can honestly say that I didn't love all my kids the same. And there were some students that I knew, okay, like take a breath, that class is coming in, and this is, I need to be kind of prepared for the fact that this student may try to get under my skin. And some days it didn't go perfectly, and that's okay, but having sort of some strategies that I already had at the ready was really helpful. This is just a resource for you all. I think it's a good one. So Megan Cave wrote this online article. It's called Don't Discipline Hangry. So 3 steps to a better classroom. So it doesn't just address, the need for food. It's sort of talking about when you are aware of your triggers, then you're better able to address those ahead of time and not sort of lose your cool. So that's a good article if you want to take a look. So all this to say, you may have noticed the title. It says, I thought we were going to talk about de-escalation. Which we are, we're getting there. But I wanted to stress the fact that actively teaching, practicing, and reinforcing self-regulation skills, both for our students and ourselves, helps to prevent student behavioral escalation in the classroom, and of course has been shown to reduce teacher stress. But just as importantly, it gives us something to start from when we need to actually think about de-escalation. So again, I should have already taught some of these strategies when our students were calm so that I have something to remind my students of when they do become dysregulated or when they are engaging in interfering behavior. And this is just a reminder, but when we're thinking about a continuum of responses for interfering behavior, we want to make sure that responses are directed at reminding the student of what more appropriate behavior looks like and providing an opportunity for the student to change their own behavior. So this is across the board, whether we're thinking about typical classroom management strategies all the way to we're trying to de-escalate a student that's agitated or accelerated. They should involve as little teacher-student confrontation and verbal interaction as possible for a number of reasons. One is that we don't want to take tons of time out of our instructional day, but also because that's not the time for me to stop and have a long conversation with you about why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah, I actually, never mind, it's an anecdote. Do you like anecdotes? Sure. Okay, so, I once saw I saw an 8-year-old walk into a classroom. He had been in a different class, and he came back to his class, and he told the teacher, I need to talk to you in the hall. And she stepped out in the hall, and I happened to be a fly on the wall that day because I was collecting data on another student. But I had my timer with me, and I turned the timer on when they stepped out in the hall. And they spent 8 minutes out in the hall with him complaining and her having this like back and forth. I'm like, this is an 8-year-old. Like, why are we having this long discussion about challenging behavior out in the hallway, especially at the request of the student, right? So interesting, but probably not completely related, but anyway, it made me think of it. So it's also late in the day for me, so I'm just being really honest at this point. So They should be administered calmly and non-emotionally. So that doesn't mean robotically, right? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we're trying not to match where the student is at if they're becoming agitated. And by the way, the bigger, louder, meaner approach just is not effective, right? So that's not our goal ever in classrooms. So us remaining calm is a really important piece. We want to cause the least amount of interruption to the lesson as possible. I like to always say this, I hope that everyone already knows this, but responses to interfering behavior should never deliberately shame or embarrass the student. So I still spend too much time in classrooms with individuals who seem to think that shame is a good way to change behavior, and it's not. And I think that if I asked, probably most of us in the audience can remember a time, regardless of how old we are, that we were shamed in front of a class, and it did not feel good. So that's just something that there are better ways. There are just better ways. So let's talk about behavioral escalation. So we're moving away from just how do we prevent and thinking about a student has become either agitated or accelerated. So 2 different levels here. We're thinking about student escalation at this level being agitation, which would be lower levels of sort of challenging behavior, but a little bit more of a challenge, you know, in the sense that you've already maybe asked the student to stop doing something and they're continuing to do it. Or then high levels of escalation, which would be more that acceleration. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. My brother's calling me. So at this point, again, agitation is this situation where we've got a student who may present interfering behavior that is slightly elevated in intensity above just your sort of typical squirreliness in the classroom. This can be looking like persistent talking out of turn or talking to peers after being asked not to, wandering the classroom during instruction, so not necessarily hurting anyone, but just, you know, you've asked them to sit back down and they haven't done so. This can also look like a lack of behavior, so staring off into space, lack of active participation in group work. You notice that the kids are all talking in their small groups, but one student's just sort of sitting there, putting their head down on their desk during independent work time as opposed to interacting with their academic materials. So at this time, we can think of a number of different strategies. You know, providing choice is always a good one. Providing choice, you can complete the worksheet independently or with a partner. Which one would you prefer? So you're not saying you can do this or not do this, but you're providing different ways of doing it. Of course, redirection, providing a brief statement. Andy, try starting that on that second section, and I'll come back to the first one. So, you know, like, I'm just going to kind of come by. Again, that proximity reminds you to get on task. Remember, if you're feeling stuck, you can ask for help. Again, we're redirecting that behavior. We could prompt a regulation routine. So prompt some sort of self-regulation strategy that we've already taught, hopefully, and practiced in the classroom. So it could be something organic, like CLO, you can grab a quick drink of water and then come back. Or would you like to use your 4 square breathing? You know, so again, something that maybe we've worked on. This is also a time that we could work on co-regulation, so assisting the student in regulating their emotions. If we see a student that is not so much acting out, but is getting upset, you know, and that can mean a lot of things. Obviously, we can define that in a number of ways, but if you know your student and you can see that they're really becoming agitated, expressing empathy, acknowledging and labeling the emotion they're having, modeling desired behavior, and then providing positive feedback for expected behavior can be really helpful. So again, this might also be our students that require some support at advanced tiers, so maybe our student that is requiring some tier 2 support. So Rosa, this is just an example. So Rosa, I want to make sure you're okay, so that's our empathy. I see that you're angry because your face is red and your fists are clenched. When I feel angry, I like to take a few deep breaths and count to 10. So can we do this together? So this could be an example of you're seeing a student that's becoming really agitated. Is there a way that, again, we can turn this around? Acceleration is just the next sort of phase within an escalation cycle. So within acceleration, the student does not respond to attempts to redirect. So some of those strategies before we may have already used, the student's not responding, or is sort of upping the ante and becoming a little bit more non-compliant or refusing verbally to listen. So verbal refusal or arguing, property destruction could happen. So maybe tearing up materials, I'm not going to do this, so I'm going to throw it on the floor kind of thing. Verbal harassment or threats towards staff and peers, even attempts to leave the classroom. So all of this could be happening during the acceleration phase. From the sort of hypoarousal phase, we might see things like the student stops making eye contact, becomes silent, and does not respond to instructional requests. Like even if I'm talking to you, it's just sort of like I'm shutting down at this point. I'm not going to respond. I'm not going to acknowledge that you're even speaking to me. So this is, again, this becomes sort of that bigger challenge. And in that case, I don't mean necessarily challenging behavior. I mean, it's like the bigger challenge directed at the teacher sometimes, right? So this is the time that we as staff need to also focus heavily on our own emotional state. Because this is a trigger for many of us. If a student is directly challenging us, and sometimes it can be very overt, like, nope, I'm not doing it. So how do we respond to that? So here we've got this kiddo that looks like they're kind of, acting in an uncooperative manner, which leads to us as teachers feeling attacked or taking it sort of personally, or feeling disrespected. The student notices our response to this. We may be trying that bigger, louder, meaner response. And the student accepts the challenge, if you will, by continuing to argue back and forth. And then the teacher feels more threatened. We ourselves go into that fight or flight mode, and then it just kind of spirals. So, this happens on a regular basis. We can sometimes see this happen in classrooms if we step in and just are like, whoa, this is way out of control, and it's not just the student that's dysregulated, it's also the staff that's clearly dysregulated. So we want to try to avoid that cycle. So we can have reminders of the regulation routine, but at this point we're going to really minimize the amount of words that we're using, again, assuming that this student is probably not regulated at this point. So I think that it always is safe to go with that assumption, even if we don't know for sure what's going on, and we'll never know for sure what's going on internally, but we can make that assumption based on their behavior. So in this case, it might be prompting that routine in a very, again, minimal word kind of way. So for example, in this example here that you probably can't read, it says point to the poster where we already have discussed this deep breathing, sort of strategy that we're using. And then, maybe saying, remember, and maybe even and again, the one thing I want to come back to each time that I do this is think about this actually playing out in a classroom and come back to that relationship piece. Right? I can do this with a student that I have a relationship with. If I'm like, paint me, like, look, remember, we're doing this, right? You're my friend, we got this, we can do this together. That's very different than student is like, I hate you, and you're telling them to breathe. So, that relationship piece really cannot be overstated enough. Handing the student the break card and saying, let's take a break. Again, not sarcastic, sassy, take a break, kid, right? It's like, let's take a break. Come on. Providing that space for some students is really important. So providing space at this point, particularly again, if a student's becoming accelerated, we want to give the student room while remaining close enough to monitor their behavior. So I'm not going to, necessarily like stand over you and put my hands on your desk and be talking to you at that point. Depending on where our kiddos are coming from, one of the things that I like to keep in mind too is just my body posture. So I don't know where you've come from, what you've experienced, what your learning history has been. I want to make sure that my hands are open, that I don't have clenched fists when I'm walking toward you. Depending on the age of the kid, I might need to get down on your level, not in your face necessarily, but just so that I'm not sort of looming over you as I'm talking. So again, this is a student that we don't know all of their learning history. We want to make sure that we're not threatening in any way. When we see signs of dysregulation, we want to prompt the student to go to a space that we have in our classroom that's for a break, if that's something that we have currently. So again, Jamie, you seem frustrated. You're welcome to take a break right now. Just reminding them, this is something that we've already taught. This is something that we've already practiced. I'm just reminding you because right now you may not be using your best brain to think about what can I do next as you're becoming upset. Again, we can use those co-regulation strategies, but we want to do this using as few words as possible. So rather than the one that I gave you earlier, which was sort of that example of, I see that you're doing, feeling this, and look, we don't want to give that many words at this point. We want to say something like, it's okay to cry. Let's grab some tissues and go sit down. Once the student is, or maybe we just say, let's grab a tissue and go sit down. It depends on kind of where you're at with this kiddo. But we want to use as few words as possible to start to transition that student to a place where they're feeling a little more calm. And again, turn this train around so that we're not continuing to head in the direction of sort of a crisis situation. I'm just checking on my time.
Kathleen?
Yes.
There was a question online. On the previous slide, you had that cycle where both the student and the adult were kind of caught in that dysregulation. Would the suggested responses be okay for an adult to present to another adult who's in that situation too, like giving them reminders about the regulation routine, giving them space out of that situation, or
absolutely?
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm understanding you correctly. So you're asking if there's more than one adult.
Mm-hmm. And you
absolutely.
See one's escalated.
If you're lucky enough to have more than one adult in your classroom, by all means, have those symbols to prompt each other, or those ways of prompting each other. One of our good friends, Alex Newson, who helped me write the brief that we were working on, she always talks about having they call it the flip your lid strategy. So, and not only were the students aware of that, but also the staff could really quickly, really show each other, like, I got to get out of here, even if it's for 3 seconds, just to take a breath. So absolutely. Is that what the question was? Okay, yeah. By all means, yeah. And that's actually coming up within the crisis piece too. So ensuring that that hopefully you have other people around you that you can do that with. I know that not all teachers are lucky enough to be in that situation, but absolutely, if you have someone else in your classroom, work those things out with them so that the adults are also communicating. And we would also kind of imagine that classrooms that have the most challenging behaviors are also going to have multiple adults in those classrooms. And so that's a way that you can sort of maximize, your supports in that way. Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, we've tried all of these things and we're still headed into crisis, right? So, of course, we can do our best to prevent crises from happening, and by, again, having strong practices in place, preventing, having prevention practices in place, even trying to have these strategies for turning things around when they're going in the wrong direction, we will take care of many of these kinds of instances, but there are going to be times where we still have crisis situations, and we need to discuss that too. So in a crisis situation, this is the highest point of escalation. So disruption is preventing class from continuing typically at this point. The student is, or we can assume that they are unable to regulate their behavior, respond to requests, or process new information. Again, it's just safe to assume that and for us to act accordingly. And the student may represent a threat to safety at this point, either to themselves or others or both. So this is where I also need to say again, obviously, we want you to prioritize your district protocols, and hopefully your district has really strong protocols for doing this. So at this point, minimizing the risk of harm to other students or themselves is, of course, top priority. And thinking about our district-approved protocols to request support and maintain safety. So some of the examples over here call for administrator assistance, give the students space with supervision, and or escort other students out of the classroom. Hopefully that's not too often. I just feel so sad when we have to do room clears. Remove items close to the student that might pose a harm. So obviously not super, we don't want to make a big deal about it, but if there are some scissors around or if there's a computer that we can block, we may need to make sure that we're doing those things in this type of crisis situation. I want to stress and cannot stress enough, this is not a teaching moment, right? This is not when we are going to teach a new skill. This is not when we are going to present consequences or threats of consequences. This is not the time for that. This is about de-escalating this situation and ensuring that everyone is safe and that the student can become regulated as quickly as possible. So this is not the time, again, to present consequences. You do want to provide some space and calm for the student, and we want to be very limited in our words that we're using. Again, if you're super dysregulated and in the middle of a crisis, I don't want to stand there and nag you and talk over you and, shake my finger at you or say, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. That's not the time for that. So the examples here of using minimal words are things like, thank you for sitting down. The very first thing a student does, thank you for lowering your voice. Anything that we can try to acknowledge that the student is doing well, great. Or just, I'm here when you're ready. I didn't mention this earlier, but with that cycle that I showed, my husband calls that, or he refers to that as don't pick up the rope. Students, they're throwing it out, right? And it's our job to be like, I'm just going to leave that rope right there. I'm going to walk on by and I'll come back in a minute. So we're not picking that up and sort of getting in a tug of war at that point. We want to stay calm. So this is also in crisis the time that we have to really focus on regulating our own behavior. So attending to our own state. And this was where I put this one, but you're right. Melissa? Yeah, okay. You're right. This is also, this could happen earlier, but definitely during crisis, this is a time that if it's safe and there are other adults present and you need to step away momentarily to regain calm, please take advantage of that. We might want to do things like breathing or tensing large muscles and then relaxing. You can tense your quads really easily without anybody noticing. But when you tense up your muscles for 3 seconds and then relax, you're sort of tricking your body into thinking that it's in a relaxed state and sort of can help to turn your own fight or flight response off. So I use that one sometimes. It's also really helpful to have a crisis support routine in your bag that you have rehearsed. So this is something that a crisis support routine is an adult routine to help staff stay calm and regulated and support the student through behavioral crisis to regain self-control. So this can look like praising the approximation of any kind of appropriate behavior, which we spoke about a moment ago, expressing some sincere empathy, and then stating the expected behavior. And when in this case, let me make this really clear. So in this case, when I say stating the expected behavior, I'm not talking about here are the behavioral expectations on the wall that you're supposed to be doing. I'm talking about like one thing that you think when the student is regulated enough they can actually do. Something like take one deep breath for me. So that would be the expected behavior in this moment, not go complete your work, right? We're in crisis mode here, so please sit down. Those are the kinds of expectations that we're talking about in this context. So let me give you a couple of examples of what this could sound like. So I appreciate that you're here. I understand you're frustrated. Can you put your hands at your sides? And then we wait 3 to 5 seconds. And then we may come back to, I understand that you're frustrated. Can you please put your hands at your sides? So having this kind of routine in your hip pocket that you have already practiced, it's not just about keeping the student calm. It's about helping you to remain calm. You know what you're supposed to do right now. You as the adult know what you're supposed to do. And that helps us to stay in our upstairs brain and to stay focused in the moment. So here's another example. So thank you. This is for 2 students. So maybe 2 students are fighting, for example, or about to fight. So thank you for lowering your voices. I can see you're both upset. Student 1, please go to the back of the room and take a seat. Student 2, can you please go to the back or the front of the room and take a seat? So again, wait 3 seconds, repeat. So it's basically, again, we're gonna remain calm. We're gonna continue to present a very simple request until the student is hopefully able to respond to that request. That also gives us an indication that the student is starting to calm down a bit and become regulated because they're able to follow that request. So again, it's just as much about our behavior as adults and how we're responding as how the student is responding in this case. I'm not going to go through all of these, but please, again, go online and look up the brief that I was talking about earlier because we give some more examples of these kinds of crisis support routines and what that might look like. And I think, I mean, it may sound silly to you, but I do these kinds of things, you know, even if you role play with your staff. And like, you know, one of us is going to get really upset right now, and I want you to practice doing this routine because you want it to be almost like muscle memory. The student has not been able to comply with my last 3 instructions. I'm going to assume that they are dysregulated, and we are going to start going with this routine. So as soon as the student is able to comply, then again, we can start on the path of maybe doing some of that co-regulation. But right now, I know what I'm supposed to do. Yes?
So my background is in mental health. I used to do home-based work with parents. And so this is what keeps going on in my mind is, as the therapist, I might have the skills to be able to step in, but really what would be most helpful is having the parent step in. So I think about that in the school building, and we have all these supports and people in place that, you know, like crisis, we rush in,
Right.
we help the student, and the teacher, to me, it undermines what the teacher is doing. And so it teaches the student, your teacher can't handle you, and then we need somebody else to do it. And then also, I think, kind of reinforces to the teacher, you can't handle the student.
Yeah.
So I think it's really nice that you're talking about keeping that teacher regulated, keeping that person in that relationship with the student.
Thank you for bringing that up. And actually, Brian Meyer, who was the person that I got this from, he is the director of Midwest PBIS, and he used to do a lot of work in group home settings with students and in clinical kind of based settings. And this was what he recommended. But I really like the point that you're making. And it almost makes me think, and again, this is a grain of salt because I'm not saying that I have evidence base for this, but it almost makes me think it might be a good idea to have like almost like different levels of the call out. You know, it's almost like the get ready because this could be a big deal kind of call out versus a get in here in my classroom and pull this kid out kind of call out. Because there are different phases of crisis. You know, there are different sort of hierarchies or levels even within the crisis situation. And if this is something that we can do something like this and actually control within the moment with the teacher and get things back on track and the student doesn't have to leave the classroom, which is also a big bonus there, that would be awesome, right? Because that should be our last line of defense is a kid having to leave the class or everybody else having to leave the class. You know, we don't want our students to leave the class. We don't want any of our students to lose that much instruction. We also just don't need it to get to that point. So I think that that's a really great point, and I appreciate you bringing it up. So something that we also need to talk about before we wrap up, and let me look at the time. We're getting close, I promise. So recovery and restoration. So there's also this point of things have calmed down. What do we do now? And this is both for students as staff as well. Because we are humans, right? We are humans as adults that also are going to at times have a hard time moving past what just happened. And that is the reality. It's also why, again, if you do have those other adults in your, on your team that you can actually rely on in that way, that can be helpful. But we want to think about this recovery and restoration piece of things. So recovery is the immediate period following the intense incident. So this is when the student, along with the staff and oftentimes even other peers, need time to regulate. So we want to reinstate calm and resume classroom activities as we're able. Keeping in mind that the student that has just had this crisis moment, they may be tired, they may need to be quiet for a bit, they may be really embarrassed about what just happened. And this can last a few minutes or it can last the rest of the day, depending on how big of a blow up this was and how long it lasted and what all it entailed. So just be prepared. This is not the time that we want to discuss what happened. This is the time that we want to welcome the student back in whatever way is appropriate, depending on if they've left the classroom or not. In this case, we're not only signaling to the student that they're welcome in the classroom, but we're also showing the peers that this student is welcome as part of our classroom community. We want to reintegrate, again, like moving into, this is what we're doing right now. So here's the example that's written here. So Quinn, would you like to start read aloud with us? The expectation is that students will sit in their desk quietly and read along or draw while I read aloud. So it's just like, this is what we're doing. Come on, we'd love to have you here. And then, of course, thank you for quietly going to your seat and getting your book out. So again, we want to find the first few things that student is doing to reinforce that we're wanting to see more of, and then focusing on the present. So again, refraining from making comments about the behavioral incident. So that can be really challenging. And I definitely have seen, unfortunately, times when a student will come back into the classroom and a really smarty kind of comment from staff will just, we go right back into escalation. Yeah.
I found that the biggest problem with that is saving face in front of peers.
Uh-huh.
So I feel like you almost have to teach everybody how to respond when someone comes back with that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that could be part of, remember earlier when we talked about teaching all of our friends how to respond if somebody's acting out, that could be part of that as well. If somebody has to leave the classroom and then they come back, this is what we do. And that could just be part of what we teach as our class-wide expectations. So again, it's not sort of leaving it up to the students to figure that out, but giving them explicitly, this is what we do. I think that's a great point. And definitely that saving face thing too. I mean, and I say this because it happens so often, but if a student comes during not so much crisis situation, but more that escalation kind of piece of things or that acceleration piece, if you ask the student to do something and they sass you, but they do it anyway, just take the fact that they did it anyway in that moment. So like, fine, whatever. And then they go sit down and get to work. Are we going to start another war over this, or are we going to just be okay with the fact that they're back in their desk and doing what they're supposed to do? And then I may praise another student for respectful language right beside them, do some of my, adjacent peer praise or things like that. I might also go back the very next morning and do some skill building piece where we're going to go back through what does it mean to talk respectfully, and we'll do some examples and non-examples. So it's not like we never get back to it. It's just that in that moment, is it worth getting back into that battle? Probably not. And then finally, restoration. So that's our final piece. So this is the stage after the student has calmed down, had a chance to return to normal activities. It may include some reparations, like if I have, torn up something, I might need to redo that assignment because I tore up the assignment. If I have thrown materials all over the room, I may need to help clean those up. It can involve apologizing to a peer. I'm not referring to having restorative kind of conversations, at least in this talk, just because I think that requires a lot of training in order for those to go right, and so we're not going to get into that. But I also just want to bring up the piece here that the staff can guide through this sort of self-reflection. So talking with the student about, and not because we're we want to reprimand. It's not about that. It's what was happening there? Again, this is the relationship building piece. It's what happened? Why did you get so upset? And if you get that upset in the, next time, what can you do instead? Or even how can I help you instead? How would you like for me to prompt you? If I notice that you're getting really upset, would you like for me to give you a symbol, a sign? You can work out different ways that you can notice or tell the student that you're noticing that they're becoming upset and maybe need a break. But you can work that out together. That's part of that relationship building piece. I'm going to skip that part just because we're short on time, but also thinking about staff self-reflection. So this is a tool that you can access, again, at midwestpbis.org. So this educator self-reflection of me also thinking about how could I have handled that differently, or maybe even just some self-acknowledgement where you're I really am glad that I handled that the way that I did. But, sort of being reflective of how did that go? Could I do it differently next time? And if the student, in fact, did push your buttons and you didn't respond in the way you would hope, then again, what are some ways that you could do that differently next time? And even acting those out or even doing some role play with your peers can be helpful. So in summary, because we are getting short on time here, so as part of an inclusive, I think we're getting short on time. Are we getting short on time? Yes. Okay. So as part of this inclusive class-wide system of support, we want to build strong student-teacher relationships. Can't say that too many times. Implement instructional strategies with a focus on self-regulation. So again, looking at this, if we've got a school-wide problem, let's address it in a school-wide way. Let's just build some of this into our Tier 1 strategies and supports. And then using evidence-based responsive interventions to prevent student behavior from escalating to unsafe levels. Just as a resource, if you're somebody that likes podcasts, we've just recently had a couple of podcasts come out where my colleagues and I and authors and I have done a couple of podcasts specifically focused on de-escalation strategies. So you've got that resource there if you're interested. And I just want to say thank you for everything that you do to support students, and I really appreciate your time.
Kathleen, can I bother you for a couple questions
Yeah,
online?
definitely.
Thanks. So a couple different versions of what do you do when you have a student who's escalated and they're refusing the break or they're refusing what you're offering?
So you're giving them the opportunity to change their behavior and
Yeah.
they're refusing. So you're kind of moving up in that chain, right? I think that one of the things that I didn't mention, I don't want it to get to this point very often because we don't want to send students out of the classroom. But when we are providing those kind of choices, earlier it was like, do you want to do this assignment in this way versus this way? Those choices can also be, again, you being very calm and saying, but also stating what the consequences are going to be. And the saying, you know, I don't want this to happen, but your choices are take a seat or you're going to have to go to the office. It's up to you. You know, and again, that also is it's a little bit of that save face part too, because it's like, and that's those situations in which the student's like, whatever, you know, and they go sit down. By all means, take the whatever, you know, like don't fight that battle. So, but yeah, if they're continuing to refuse, like you've got a list of strategies here, but there are points in which you're going to get to that mode of I've exhausted all of my resources and those are our only two choices, kid. But, you know, rather than just saying go to the office, it can be, you know, these are our two options right now. I would love for you to stay in class.
Thank you. The other question that came up is if you have a setup process where students can take a break within the classroom and you feel like maybe they're taking advantage of that, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was saying earlier. If you see, hopefully try to prevent that again by having a really enriched classroom with high density reinforcement schedules going on. If you notice that students are taking a break, then I would go over and above what you're already doing and have some kind of system in place where you're reinforcing being part of the class and staying on task. And so if you take breaks, you know, you're not going to be punished for doing that, but you're also not going to get access to this thing that everybody else is getting access to.
Thank you. I think that's the last one.
Okay.
We could thank Kathleen one more time.